All right. The first video was microevolution. We're now moving on to macroevolution. Say hi. Okay. Macroevolution, first set of slides. Um, Macroevolution is looking at big picture stuff, so not alleles anymore. We start with talking about taxonomy, the idea that like we put things into categories. Most specific is species, genus, family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, and then domain. We use this just to name things, and we found that like they're not as accurate groupings as we would have liked. Um, the other way that we organize how we identify organisms or species is by phylogenetic trees. This shows relationships between morphology, so how they look, embryology, what they look like as an embryo, and DNA, RNA, and protein similarities. Um, Basically, what we see is that we see this like a cladogram, which you learn how to make, splits. If you want to know more about this, we can chat. Example of a phylogenetic tree showing evolutionary relationships. Right, the two on the far right would be the most related, the one on the far left, and then the far right would be the furthest or least related. Um, we call each end of a phylogenetic tree a taxa or a taxon. Basically just showing relationships. A clade would be just like a fork of it. Um, so when we look at the relationships between things, um, excuse me, we see that there's two types of changes. Anagenesis is the accumulation of changes in one species that leads to speciation over time. It's the evolution of population as a whole. Cladogenesis is the budding of one or more new species from a species that already exists. So anagenesis, one species becomes a new species. Cladogenesis, I still have my original species, but I have like one budding off. Um, how do I look at those relationships and how this happens? I looked at fossil records. I look at homologous features like ancestral and derived traits. I don't look at analogous traits really, which is here. Things that same function, but were not evolutionarily similar. Um, this just talks about why they exist. Homologous versus analogous. Homologous is the one that shows a relationship. I also look at the genetics. How much DNA do I have in common with other organisms? Um, this is a theory. The molecular clock hypothesis states that among closely related species, a given gene usually evolves at a reasonably constant rate. This idea is just that evolution is at a constant pace. Um, so when we are looking at phylogeny or relationships, we look at a variety of things. Basically, maximum likelihood states that when considering multiple hypothesis, we should look at the one that makes the most sense over time. So when we're looking at relationships, we go with our gut basically. Like, does this make sense that one species evolved from the next? Maximum parsimony means that we look at multiple explanations for the different relationships and we go with the simplest one for evolution. And so that's kind of how we go about it. Making a cladogram based on traits. You know how to do this. We've done this in lab before, right? That the ones with the most similar traits are going to be the most directly related, right? So if we look at a lancelet, that's going to be least related to my leopard. Looks like this, right? Make sure you know how to make one of these. Switching gears to part 2. Macroevolution. So this kind of looks at analogous traits and analogous colors. Again, the definition of a species is can mate and produce viable offspring that can reproduce. Things like a mule, a horse, and a donkey, they make an organism, but they cannot reproduce. This again defines macroevolution for you if you need it. So when we're looking at evolution, first we should talk about asexual species. Most have evolved from asexual species, and they've adapted to be able to reproduce without the need of a mate. Dandelions are asexual, the pollen is sterile, and the egg is diploid already, so it doesn't need fertilization. A ring species, so moving away from asexual species, is a connected series of neighboring populations, each of which can interbreed when they are close to each other. Technically, it's all one species, but kind of separate populations, right? If we look at this map of a certain lizard, like where the two colors meet, there's probably some mating of those organisms, and that shows where the interbreeding is going to happen. This just like maintains genetic diversity. When we limit that interbreeding, we start to see speciation occur, right? Dogs, things like that. When I limit interbreeding of certain organisms based on what I want to select for, we'll see that. They also will be separated because of like location, because of a variety of things, and that's when we get speciation. You've seen this? Cladogenesis, anagenesis. Some other types of speciation, allopatric occurs because a given group has been separated from the parent group, usually a geographic separation. Sympatric will occur even when they are living together. Allopatric speciation, there's geographic isolation, and the two populations start to split. This is shown by like a mountain and stuff like that. If they maybe come back together and they can't interbreed, we officially have two new species. Another type of speciation that we see is adaptive radiation, is that based on, you usually see it in islands, based on the specific environment of the island, we see the organism adapt, and we see multiple species come out of one starting species. Common ancestor at the very bottom, all of the species up top. Galapagos, adaptive radiation, talking about the founder effect, the small group, a couple birds go to each island, they found a whole new species based on traits. Yeah, you know this. This is just like explaining it in more detail. Again, explaining more about that. How does speciation occur? A variety of things, and so we've talked about some of them. But then we also see, once I have these two species, what prevents them from mating? We have prezygotic, so before egg is fertilized, and postzygotic barriers. Prezygotic, before mating, so ecogeographical, so totally located in a different area, and like when they are mating. Habitat isolation, so in the water or in a different part of the stream. Seasonal isolation, when they are ready to mate during the season, can vary, and so if it's not ready to mate, they cannot mate. Behavioral isolation, courtship, means that they're not ever going to mate. Mechanical, their parts physically don't fit together. Gametic isolation, don't have the same number of chromosomes, right? We have to mate with something that also has 23 chromosomes. Postzygotic, so this can be after that happens. If fertilization does occur, the development of the embryo is irregular and it is aborted. Sheep and goats can mate, but because they have different number of chromosomes, the fertilized egg will die. Hybrid inviability, if the organism is born, the hybrid organism cannot produce offspring. Postzygotic, hybrid sterility. Hybrid inviability, they're born but they die very quickly. Sterility is when they can come to maturation but they can't reproduce. Selective hybrid elimination. The hybrids are viable and fit. And they may continue on, but hybrids that are weaker and low fitness will usually be selected against. There's some cases in which organisms will kill their own offspring that are like weak. Selective hybrid elimination basically the hybrid is eliminated because species will mate with like species. So even if they are viable, they don't get to mate. There's just a summary of that. Pre and post zygotic barriers. That is done. I wonder if I can open another one really quick. 1, 2, 3, 4. See if this works. There we go. Okay. Still macroevolution. I'm gonna try. That'll be just this, and then the last video because there's just the other set of slides. Types of speciation. Allopatric is the evolution of geographically isolated organisms. Parapatric, geographically adjacent, so not touching or not integrated, but not totally separate. Sympatric happens for other reasons besides geographic isolation. Sympatric speciation, right? The question is, how can they become two different species if they are in the same location? This deals with either like habitat, different habitats within an area, different consumption of food. Basically, two groups start to like become isolated because of where their niche is, as opposed to a geographic isolation. This happens a lot in the ocean because basically based on this is just talking about based on where you are in the ocean, you're receiving different color light waves and different energy, therefore different organisms will live in different types of light. This just talks about the physics of like why the ocean is blue. What's important here is that based on where you are, certain fish will live, and so even though they are in the same water and very close to each other, they will not mate, and so we end up having this speciation occur. When we are also talking about sympatric speciation, so non-geographic separated speciation, polyploidy refers to instant speciation, which occurs most often in plants. Polyploidy cells in organisms contain more than 2 pairs, so extra chromosomes, and so then during mitosis, I create a whole new organism, basically. So that's polyploidy. Autopolyploidy refers to the occurrence in which the number of chromosomes doubles in the offspring due to non-disjunction, so non-separating during meiosis, right? Because during meiosis, I split them all in half. What happens if one cell gets nothing and the other cell gets them all? I get double the chromosomes, and so I get a totally new species, an organism with a totally different set of chromosomes. Looks like this. Chromosomal rearrangement. We also see if there is so much rearrangement during crossing over, we have like a totally new species develop. How quickly does this happen? There's some theories about this. Gradualism is the idea that evolution works very slowly and changes accumulate. Usually a species doesn't just show up overnight. People also believe, though, that punctuated equilibrium, the idea that like we go a long time and then suddenly an event occurs and a new species exists, they also believe that this is potentially a possibility. So we're going to pause here. We've got one last set of slides, and then we'll move on to